Now, as the name of the video implies, this is the fifth and final part of a story, so if you haven't seen the first 4 parts yet, this likely won't make any sense to you, so I'd recommend checking out part 1, and if you like it, making your way back here for this one. I'll include a link to all previous parts in the description below. And now, without further ado, let's finish this story. We start right where we left off, with Luke Skywalker and Kylo Ren standing face to face, a few paces apart on a barren, muddy world, while all around them a storm rages. We then hear Kylo Ren say, "I feel it, your fear." To that, Luke offers him an almost apologetic look and says, "The only fear in me is for what I may have to do here, Ben." But Kylo quickly responds, "No, you fear for her. Fear what my knights will do to her." Luke gives a tiny smirk and says, "Fear for her? No, I pity what will happen to your knights when they catch up to an angry, grieving Wookiee." This time, Kylo is not so quick to answer, so Luke, his expression softening, continues, "Why, Ben? Why did you do it? Why did you do any of it?" To that, Kylo gives a slight shake of the head before saying, "You still understand so little." "Then help me understand," Luke quickly says back, taking a step forward and almost reaching out a hand to him. Luke quickly glances all around him and then says, "Is this where the compass took you all those years ago? To Snoke?" We hear Kylo give a bit of a snort before saying, "The compass. It is only one of many that once existed. They were used by the ancient Jedi to guide a Padawan to their final test, to lead them to face their greatest fear, and see if they could overcome it to truly become a Jedi." Luke now looks at Kylo skeptically, and Kylo continues, "You think I lie, and yet you now understand why it never led you anywhere. Because the legendary Luke Skywalker had already become a Jedi when he faced his greatest fear and defeated it, when he faced and destroyed 2 Sith Lords." But as Kylo is saying this, Luke shuts his eyes and shakes his head as if he just can't bear to hear it one more time. Luke then says, "I've told you so many times, Ben. I did not fight them. I didn't destroy them. Anakin destroyed Vader and Sidious. You admire your grandfather for all the wrong reasons, Ben." A burst of anger then seems to come over Kylo, and we see his hand move towards his lightsaber, but he does not take hold of it. He then says, "I know the truth. I seen it. My true master showed me, and soon she will see it too." The scene then shifts, and we see the 7 Knights of Ren quickly traversing the muddy landscape and weaving their way through the dead forest. And then we focus in on one of them in particular, and see he is carrying some type of medium-sized black, cubed-shaped box. The scene then shifts again, and we see Chewbacca, still carrying Rey, rather slowly and awkwardly making his way through the forest and constantly being hindered by the low-hanging branches. Finally, after practically getting himself tangled up in a tree, Chewbacca sits Rey down, and after she helps the tall Wookiee free himself, she looks up at him and says, "We have to go back and help Luke." Chewie roars something in response, and Rey then says back, "But he does need our help. He won't give up on Ben, even if it costs him his life." Chewie seems to think this over for a moment, then roars something back, and Rey responds, "I know what he told you, that you were to protect me no matter what. But Ben will kill him, just like he killed Han." These words seem to resonate with Chewie, but before we see his response, the scene then shifts back to Kylo and Luke, and we hear, coming from Kylo Ren's command shuttle, blaster fire. And a few moments later, as Kylo and Luke turn their attention to it, we watch as Finn, now holding a blaster rifle, runs down the ramp of the shuttle. But Kylo lets out some type of angry, frustrated curse, and immediately raises his hand and freezes Finn in place. But that's when Luke makes a subtle motion with his hand, and Kylo's force hold over Finn is broken. Finn, a little confused, then stands there briefly looking at the two of them, at which point Luke makes a motion with his head in the general direction Rey and Chewie have gone, and wordlessly, Finn then runs off in that direction. Kylo again lets out some type of angry curse, and he raises his hand once more to freeze Finn in place. But Luke quickly says, "Is that the only trick you've got? Snoke hasn't taught you anything new?" Kylo then stops himself, turns his attention back to Luke, and takes hold of his saber, though he still does not ignite it. He then blurts out, "The Supreme Leader is powerful, but he too bows before another." Luke seems confused by this, and Kylo explains, "You think the compass took me to him, but you're wrong. It took me to them." Luke's confusion grows even more, and he echoes, "To them." We then focus in on the masked face of Kylo Ren, and see that it is trembling ever so slightly as he begins. "It was a beautiful world, not on any star charts, yet the Force led me there, through the compass. and it was there that I met them, a woman and her young daughter. Realization begins to dawn upon Luke, and he says, Ben, what did you do? Kylo, seemingly ignoring Luke, then says, somehow she knew who I was and that I'd be coming. She couldn't leave the world. She was trapped there and wanted me to take her daughter away, to take her to you. But I knew what that would mean. Luke sighs, lowers his head, and says mostly to himself, you felt your parents had cast you aside, and you thought I would do the same if I found out about Rey. Kylo then blurts out, trembling even worse now, I agreed to take her, but only because I wanted to destroy her. And that's when we get a flashback and see a young, angry Ben Solo holding an ignited blue lightsaber and standing over a wide-eyed and innocent-looking young Rey. Before he lowers the saber and seems disappointed in himself, we then hear Kylo in the present say, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't kill her, so I decided to hide her instead. The flashback then shifts, and we now see the young Ben Solo holding on his arm and hand, palm outwards, towards the young Rey, locking her in a force hold, and freezing her in place until the young girl loses consciousness, at which point he lets the hold go and lets her collapse to the floor of the small shuttle they're in. We then hear Kylo in the present say, I tried to sever her strong connection to the Force, to make her forget who she was, but at first I thought I had killed her. We then see, in the flashback, young Ben trying to awaken the unconscious Rey. Finally, her eyes flutter open, and the first thing Rey does is mutter one word, Ren. To this, a confused young Ben shakes his head and simply says, no, your name is Rey. In the present, we then hear Kylo say, when she woke up, I took her to Jakku, a world once so strong with the light, but now so shrouded in darkness, that I didn't think you would ever be able to sense her there, thanks to the conflicting chaos of the two. I gave her to the first junk dealer I came across, and told her that she must wait there for her family, that she must never leave, because they would come back for her. The flashback then ends, and we now focus in on the face of Luke Skywalker, who has his eyes closed. He then says, the compassion I felt in you when you returned, it was because of her, because you couldn't kill her. But Kylo snaps back, no, the weakness you felt in me was because of her. Luke then opens his eyes and says, no, Ben, you were different when you returned. I felt it then, and I still feel it now. You were ready to become a Jedi. You may not have brought her back to me, but you had passed the test the compass led you to when you didn't kill her. Luke takes another step towards Kylo and says, Rey told me that when you faced her, that you could have destroyed her, but you didn't. Kylo then says, still trembling, I wasn't even sure it was her at first. I searched her mind and saw the blurred past that I had likely left behind. But when grandfather's saber chose her over me, when my family had rejected me again, I knew who she was, and I knew someday she would learn the truth and join us. Luke then replies, join who? You and Snoke? But Kylo says back, I've told you, Snoke serves the same master I do. In fact, freeing him was the first command given to me by my true master. The scene suddenly shifts, and at first, we briefly get a shot of Kylo Ren laying his hand upon the burnt and melted helmet of Darth Vader, before we're taken to another scene from the past, and this time, it's one straight out of Rey's Force vision from The Force Awakens, where Kylo and his Knights of Ren are on a stormy world slaughtering what looks like the members of some type of clan who are all dressed in similar attire. That's when, as we've seen before, we watch as Kylo Ren stabs his saber through the back of one of these clan members, right before that clan member could bring his weapon down upon someone. And now we see who he was trying to kill. It was one of his fellow clan members, a very old and feeble-looking woman, who then says up to Kylo, You don't understand what you're doing, boy. Releasing him will bring untold ruin upon the galaxy once more. Kylo then says back, No, he will once again serve his purpose. Before Kylo then crouches down and extends a hand to the old woman and begins to probe her mind. He then says, And now you will show me how to release him. We're then back in the present, where Luke says, You freed Snoke. Kylo gives a nod of the head and says, The end of the Sith awoke him. I merely released him from his prison, a prison he was placed in by our true master so that he could begin to understand his place. And when he was finally freed, he too yielded to our master once more, and took over the emerging First Order, which had been built upon the ashes of the Empire, but lacked a true leader, a supreme leader, like it once had with Palpatine. Luke then asks, And who is this true master you speak of? Kylo then turns his head and looks off in the direction Chewie carried Rey off in and says, "Perhaps she will tell you herself when grandfather shows her the truth." That's when the scene shifts, and we're with the 7 Knights of Ren as they continue to make their way through the skeletal forest, when suddenly, from behind a very large tree stump, Chewie, roaring angrily, emerges and immediately grabs one of the Knights of Ren by the neck, easily lifts him off his feet, and throws him into and through one of the nearby trees. He then draws his fist back, smashes it into the face of one of the other knights, and that knight promptly slumps to the ground, motionless. One of the other Knights of Ren then raises a bladed weapon and is about to bring it down on Chewie when Rey emerges from behind a tree, activates her blue saber, and slices the weapon in half. That's when Chewie turns and with all his might pushes his hand into the chest of the knight who is about to strike him down, causing the knight to fly backwards. We then hear another lightsaber activate and see the Knight of Ren Kylo earlier rewarded with one, standing there holding it in a challenging way. Without thought or hesitation, Chewie charges at him, but the knight quickly dodges and counterattacks with the saber, striking Chewie across the chest and shoulder and sending the Wookiee tumbling to the ground and crying out in pain. Rey then springs to action and attacks the knight before he can finish off Chewie. Rey and the Knight of Ren then begin to hack back and forth at each other, it being quite clear neither is all that skilled with a lightsaber, but both have known combat with similar weapons. That's when we focus in on the knight who had been carrying the medium-sized box, and we watch as he sets it down upon the tree stump Chewie had been hiding behind, and, with a hesitant reverence, opens the box, reaches in, and removes from it the burnt and melted helmet of Darth Vader. Immediately then, when the badly wounded Chewie spots it from where he lies, he lets out a hate-fueled roar that echoes throughout the entire woods, which is when, for just a moment, we flash to Finn, who hears the roar, changes the direction he'd been running slightly, and seems to run even faster now in the proper direction. We're then again with Rey, who hacks away feverishly at the Knight of Ren, who clumsily manages to block her attacks, when suddenly she just stops her attacks altogether, slowly lowers her arm holding the saber, and even slower yet, turns her head as if she hears or senses something, and quickly her eyes focus and lock upon the nearby knight holding the helmet of Vader. Seemingly in a trance-like state now, she begins to walk towards it. That's when the scene shifts back to Kylo and Luke, and we hear the distant angry roar of Chewbacca. That's when Kylo, in an all too pleased voice, says, "Perhaps you put too much faith in your old friend's pet Wookiee." For the first time, we see something almost like anger briefly wash across the face of Luke. That's when Luke says, as if he too suddenly senses something, "Vader's helmet. What will it show her?" Kylo says back with a slight shrug, "The truth about our family." Luke shakes his head to that, but that's when we hear another voice, the voice of Leia, as we see her walking down the ramp of Kylo Ren's shuttle, and she says, "Go to her, Luke. Let me deal with my son." Luke then looks to Leia, his face showing both overwhelming joy and horrible sadness and regret. He then says, as if it's the only thing he can manage to say, "Leia, I'm sorry." And with those words, something seems to snap in Kylo Ren, and he finally activates the saber he's been holding and takes a swing at Luke. But with grace and ease, Luke dodges it. Kylo then points his saber at Luke and says, "And now you will show me the power you unleashed upon Vader and his master. You will show me what you refused to train me, the power of the light." For a very long moment, Luke looks at Kylo Ren with only sadness upon his face. Finally, he says with a conceding nod of the head, "Very well then. I'll show you how I defeated them." He then takes his saber from his belt, ignites the green-bladed weapon, and simply stands there. A moment later, Kylo springs and attacks, and Luke simply and easily blocks the attack, and then the one that follows it, and the one that follows that. And that's when we focus in on Leia, and watch her hang her head, before the scene shifts again. And we're now watching as Rey slowly walks towards the helmet of Vader, which the Knight of Ren who had it now sets down upon the tree stump next to the box, before taking a step or two back and falling to a knee and lowering his head. That's when all the other remaining Knights of Ren also drop to a knee and lower their head as Rey continues to walk towards the helmet of Vader. After Chewie looks around briefly, clearly confused as to what's going on, he again lets out an angry roar and attempts to get to his feet. But the knight with the saber quickly rises, activates it again, and moves to finish Chewie off. But Rey, for a moment, snaps out of her trance and holds out a hand to the knight and tells him to stop. And the knight instantly does. Rey then looks at Chewie and says, "I have to see this. I have to know." Chewie then makes one last, soft, pleading-sounding roar, but Rey either doesn't hear it or ignores it and is once again completely focused on the helmet and walks towards it once more. And when she reaches it and begins to extend a hesitant hand towards it, we hear Finn scream out, "Rey!" which stops her, and all the Knights of Ren jump to their feet and start to move towards Finn. But Rey quickly says, "No, wait, stop, all of you!" And the Knights of Ren do, and again quickly fall to a knee, save the one with the red saber, who activates it again and charges at Finn. We then focus in on Finn, watching as the knight comes at him with the saber blazing, and he says, "Not this again," as he raises his blaster to shoot him, but that's when Rey screams out, "I said stop!" and reaches out her hand towards the Knight of Ren with the saber, and hits him with a force blast that sends him flying through the air. Rey then looks at her hand in amazement, as the other Knights of Ren seem to look at each other unsure what to do. Finn then, also looking unsure about all this, runs towards Rey, but is stopped when one of the Knights of Ren rises and quickly gets between the two of them. Finn then says to Rey, looking around the Knight of Ren blocking him, what exactly is going on here? What is all this?" Rey smiles faintly as we see tears well up in her eyes. She then says, "I knew I'd see you again." Finn seems confused by that and says, "Of course you would. We're friends after all." He then glances around at all the kneeling Knights of Ren and focuses on the one in front of him and says, "Though I'm not too sure what to make of all your new friends." Rey gives a slight shake of the head and looks around at them and says, I don't know what to make of all this either, but I have to find out. I have to find my place." She then turns her attention back to the helmet of Vader, which is when Finn gives another quick look at the Knight of Ren blocking his path, steps around them, and holds out his hand to Rey and says, "Your place can be with me, Rey. You don't have to bother with whatever you think this will show you." Rey instantly shuts her eyes, and we see tears stream down her face. "I wish it were that easy," she says. "It can be," Finn says back, taking another step towards her. "Come with me," he pleads. That's when the scene shifts, and we're now watching as Kylo angrily attacks Luke, but each attack is either easily avoided or blocked by Luke's green saber, and not once do we see Luke attack back or do anything but defend himself. We then see Kylo Ren take such an anger-fueled swing at Luke that he loses his balance and falls into the mud. Kylo then looks up at Luke and screams, "Fight me!" But Luke simply says back, "Fight you? But you wanted me to show you how I defeated Vader and Sidious." "And that's exactly what I'm doing, Ben." Luke then reaches out his hand to the fallen Kylo Ren and says, "Besides, you know what will happen if you destroy me. You know what I will become." "Do I?" Kylo snaps back. "And where are your old masters? Where have they been all these years while you failed to rebuild the Jedi Order? Perhaps they are not as powerful as you thought." Kylo then, ignoring Luke's hand, gets to his feet and says, "Never once did those who instructed you come to me. The only one that ever did was Vader, and from him I have learned the truth." Luke lets out a tired sigh and says, "Then tell me, Ben, what did Vader reveal to you?" Kylo responds, "He wanted to finish something that had been started long ago by another when the war between the Jedi and Sith tore the galaxy apart. He wanted to fulfill a prophecy that the Jedi had foolishly clung to for generations, thinking it would bring about their savior, when it would only bring about their destroyer. And he desperately wanted you at his side to do it. He wanted to share it with his son." That's when Kylo slightly turns his head and sees standing directly behind him now is Leia, and she says to him, "Ben, Darth Vader was a liar and a monster. He wasn't interested in sharing anything with anybody. He only wanted to use Luke to help destroy the Emperor and rule the galaxy, the same way Snoke is using you now, feeding you with these lies about your grandfather and some true purpose you have." Just then, the three of them spot and then soon hear a slowly approaching ship that is rather low in the sky, and one that looks much like Kylo Ren's command shuttle, but is being accompanied by 4 TIE fighters. Kylo raises a triumphant fist into the sky and declares, "The Supreme Leader has come to fight at my side, and now you will begin to understand what true power is, the true power of the dark side." But as soon as Kylo finishes saying that, Snoke's command shuttle simply flies overhead and begins to descend far off in the distance, in the direction that Rey has gone. Kylo's raised fist drops to his side and his head hangs ever so slightly. Luke then says, "And the true nature of the dark side does indeed reveal itself." He then turns, locks eyes with Leia, and she simply says to him, "Go." Luke looks at Kylo Ren, and Leia then says, "We'll be fine, Luke." Without another word or look then, Luke rushes off into the dead forest. Which is when we're then back with Rey, and watch as she looks back and forth between the helmet of Darth Vader and the hand extended out to her by Finn. She then hears in her head the voice of Anakin Skywalker from her vision say, "Rey, 2 paths are set before you, but only you can choose which will be your destiny." Rey then begins to reach her hand out to Finn, but stops and hesitates when they all hear a ship and look to the sky and see a shuttle quickly coming in for a landing. Rey then mutters, as if confused by her own word or why she's even saying it, "Snoke." And when Finn hears her say that, he raises his blaster rifle and points it at the helmet of Vader. But the Knight of Ren, who had been blocking his path moments ago, quickly takes his weapon and stabs Finn in the back with it before he can even fire at the helmet. Rey immediately screams out in anger and takes her saber, ignites it, and quickly cuts down the Knight of Ren, who has stabbed Finn. Anger on her face now, she then turns as the other 2 remaining Knights of Ren quickly begin to move towards her, but they seem to see her anger and quickly stop and exchange a look with each other, as if again not sure how to proceed. The shuttle then finishes landing in a nearby clearing, and Rey's anger instantly fades as she crouches down over Finn. But before she can check to see if he's okay, something seems to physically take hold of her and pulls her back to her feet and moves her in front of the helmet of Vader again. Rey then screams out defiantly, "Nothing it could show me would ever make me want to join you." She then hears, as if coming from over her shoulder, though nothing is actually there, the voice of Snoke say, "Look upon your destiny and understand your true place in all this." But Rey shakes her head and says, "I know my place. It's to become a Jedi." The voice of Snoke then says, "And yet you hear a different destiny call out to you, your true destiny. And you cannot deny your desire to know who and what you really are." And at this point, Rey reaches out and lays a hand upon the helmet of Darth Vader. But it's hard to tell if she does it of her own free will, or if something has forced her to. Nevertheless, as soon as she touches it, we focus in on Rey's face, and we see a storm of all sorts of different emotions make their way across it, from joy and happiness, to anger and confusion, to shock and horror, and finally, at the end, to a look of understanding. She then removes her hand from the helmet, takes a step back, and then takes Anakin's old blue lightsaber, activates it, raises it over her head, and brings it down upon the helmet of Darth Vader, splitting it and most of the tree trunk it rested upon in half. She then turns, doesn't even glance at the 2 Knights of Ren as she passes them by, and heads for Snoke's shuttle with determination in her steps as the ramp begins to lower. The 2 Knights of Ren then take up positions behind her, and a third one, the one with the saber that she force pushed earlier, also joins them, though he has a noticeable limp and holds his side. And as Rey reaches the base of the shuttle's ramp, we hear the voice of Luke Skywalker call out her name. Rey then turns, looks at Luke with a face that holds almost no emotion, and says, "I know what I have to do now. I know how to end this, to end all of this. Trust me." Before Luke can even say anything, Rey turns, walks up the ramp, followed by the Knights of Ren, and soon enough, the ship is taking off and flying up into the atmosphere and away from the planet. We then watch as Luke quickly makes his way over to Chewie, who has fallen unconscious now, and watch as Luke concentrates over the Wookiee for a moment, only to breathe a sigh of relief a few seconds later. Luke then makes his way over to Finn and again concentrates for a moment, and seems very surprised by what he feels. In fact, he stares at Finn for a very long moment before Finn's eyes open, and we see him try to move, but can't. Finn then says, looking up at Luke, "You're Luke Skywalker, aren't you?" Luke simply nods, and Finn breathes a sigh of relief and says, "Where's Rey?" To that, Luke only lowers his head, and Finn tries to move again, but still can't. He then says, "I don't suppose you're good at fixing things." Luke gives something like a modest shrug and says that tinkering runs in his family. Finn then says, "I think this new spine of mine got damaged when I was stabbed, though I think it may have also saved my life." Luke is about to say something to that when suddenly it's as if he senses something, and his head snaps up and he mutters, "Ben," before telling Finn he'll be back for him, and he runs off. That's when the scene shifts, and we seem to jump into the middle of a conversation between Leia and Kylo Ren, and we hear Leia say to him, "It's still not too late, Ben." Kylo then responds with his back to Leia and says, "And could you forgive me for what I did to my father?" Leia shuts her eyes and just can't seem to muster up an answer. It's then that we see, from their perspective now, Snoke's shuttle flying up and away from the planet and leaving Kylo Ren behind. That's when Kylo says as he watches it go, "Luke failed. She's with Snoke now. She's learned the truth." Leia then says, "What does that even mean, Ben?" Kylo removes his helmet and lets it fall to the mud. He then looks Leia in the eyes and says, "She knows the true purpose of the Skywalkers, a purpose I too cannot deny." Leia frowns, her way of saying that answered nothing. Kylo, however, ignores her questioning look and begins to head for his shuttle. Leia then calls out, "Ben, wait, don't go. Luke can help you. We can help you." But Kylo only continues to walk away and says, "Luke cannot help me. He is a true Jedi Master and heeds the will of the Force. And what I must do goes against that will." Leia now looks more confused than ever, but says no more, and simply watches as her son heads for the shuttle and flies away. Soon after, we see Luke emerge from the dead forest, and he walks up to Leia, glances briefly at the helmet of Kylo Ren in the mud, before wrapping his sister in an embrace, and the scene ends. That's when we're taken into space high above the planet, where, for a moment, we're taken into the cockpit of Kylo Ren's shuttle, and watch him punch at the controls briefly before the ship makes the jump into hyperspace. That's when there is a very long moment of silence before we see a half dozen or so New Republic cruisers, along with the Resistance flagship, emerge from hyperspace and immediately begin to attack the few First Order Star Destroyers in orbit. The scene then shifts, and we find ourselves on the bridge of one of those New Republic cruisers, where Poe Dameron stands with two senators, the well-dressed human male and the equally well-dressed Togruta female, along with a blue holographic image of Admiral Ackbar. And we hear Poe say to them all, "Looks like the tracker and my buddy Finn led us right to the First Order stronghold, if it can even be called that considering how few ships are here." Ackbar then comments, "Likely most of their fleet is still spread across the galaxy in search of senators." Poe nods and says, "A shame Hux and his Star Destroyer is one of those still on the loose." Ackbar comments back, "Take heart, Commander Dameron. At least we destroyed the other 3 Star Destroyers that were with him." Poe then says, "You're right, Admiral, but now let's hope Leia and Finn are okay." That's when we switch scenes and watch as the Millennium Falcon breaks through the swirling cloud cover around the planet and into space, where we see the New Republic fleet is now sitting amongst the ruins of several Star Destroyers, but also the ruins of one of their own ships. We then watch as the Falcon makes its way into the landing bay of Leia's Resistance flagship, where there waiting for it are Poe Dameron, Admiral Ackbar, and seemingly almost every other Resistance member. And when the ramp to the Falcon lowers and Leia begins to walk down it, followed closely by R2-D2 and Luke Skywalker, a cheer erupts from all assembled. Leia then walks up to Poe and says, "Excellent work, Commander Dameron." Poe smiles and says back, "Thank you, Chancellor Organa." Leia blinks in confusion to being called that, and Poe quickly says, "Oh, you didn't hear about the vote." Leia looks even more confused now and says, "What vote?" Poe then explains, "What's left of the Senate has voted, unanimously might I add, to elect you acting Chancellor." Poe then gives a grin and says, "Never mind the fact that only 2 senators were actually around to cast a vote." Leia gives a little frown and says, "Well, with my first act as Chancellor, I want you to get a medical team up here immediately. Finn and Chewie were hurt." Poe then nods and promises to take care of it personally. That's when Luke and Leia slip away from the celebratory crowd into the hangar bay door, where they look out at the churning storm covering the world below. And Leia says, "They're both going to find their way. I can feel it." Luke nods but says nothing. Leia then says, "Do you think anything Ben said was true about what our father was really trying to accomplish?" Luke shuts his eyes and says, "Looking back, I do. Vader was desperate for me to join him, and not just because he thought I could help him destroy the Emperor. There was more. I was just too young and focused on saving him to see it." The two are silent for a very long moment before Leia says, "They really are going to be okay, Luke." Luke once again nods his head as if he agrees with that, but the look on his face says otherwise. And that is where this story ends, for now. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now let me say thank you so much for watching my version of Episode 8, and please let me know what you thought about this part and the whole story in general in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And yes, I will likely be making an Episode 9 in the not too distant future to follow up and finish the story. But for now, again, thanks for watching.